Hi and welcome to this mini webinar from our Observation, Assessment and Planning in the Early Years series. My name is Sarah and I'm an Early Years advisor with both hands-on and advisory experience in a range of early years settings. I'm often asked about the use and effectiveness of observation, assessment and planning by setting managers and practitioners, so today we're going to explore some top tips as a starting point for thinking. What we'll explore during this webinar are some key principles. We'll reflect on some common myths around expectations, think about what to consider when observing in the early years, look at some different types of assessment in the early years foundation stage, and bringing it all together, observation, assessment and planning in action. So first, all early years settings will have some kind of recording system in place for observing, assessing and planning for young children. This does really vary between different settings as there isn't any set or statutory format in place. We might see online learning journals, specific recording formats or less formal approaches. The lack of set formats might seem like an issue or irregularity, but actually in practice it's a good thing, as any recording system has to be relevant for the context and approaches of your own setting. What we look at when we support settings is the content of observation, assessment and planning and how it's used, not the format it's recorded on. The format is merely the tool to record your thinking. All the ideas we're exploring today can be applied to whichever format your setting uses. What is recognised is that managers and practitioners can be left feeling confused about what effective processes look like, which leads us on to our next slide. So go back to basics. In the midst of a maze of guidance and advice, which can often leave us early years practitioners at best overwhelmed and at worst de-skilled, it's always useful to return to this observation, assessment and planning cycle, which is illustrated in the early years foundation stage development matters guidance. This can help clarify our thinking and reduce some confusion. It's through this cycle that we remember the simple key principles. That is how we find out about our children and meet their needs and interests. What's really crucial to note here is there's no mention of paperwork at all. Much of this cycle will happen day to day as part of our daily practice with children, and it's not necessarily noted down. So the principles are observation, the starting point where you look, listen and note. Moving on to assessment, where you analyse your observations, make sense of them and decide what they tell you about your children. And then planning, what next? Which experiences, opportunities, learning environments, resources, routines and practitioner role will you plan? And then back to step one and so on. So when focusing on back to basics principles, it's also important to remember that the success of observation, assessment and planning is very reliant on a good knowledge of child development. This is a continuous path in your professional development journey. EYFS development matters and early years outcomes are examples of excellent guidance, but should be complemented by further reading and research, such as the examples on this slide. We quite often hear questions about the number of observations and assessments that should be completed, and if there are specific statements from the EYFS that should be copied into planning. Are these questions familiar to you? What do you think the answer is to these questions? It's likely you'll encounter many more myths and confusion around this, so do make sure you're familiar with the EYFS requirements and guidance. The EYFS is very clear. Assessment should not entail prolonged breaks from interaction with children, nor require excessive paperwork. Paperwork should be limited to that which is absolutely necessary to promote children's successful learning and development. So there's no requirement for the amount or number of recorded observations you need to do, and observations should not interrupt play or your support for learning. Reference to development matters or early years outcomes guidance is really useful as it helps us to track a child's progress throughout the EYFS. However, it is really important to use your own knowledge of the uniqueness of each child and the context of your setting when planning. We have seen examples in planning that include things like create a cosy area under the stairs, which has been copied from development matters, when in fact the setting doesn't actually have any stairs. So you can use the guidance statements in development matters or early years outcomes to inform your planning for next steps, but you should be mindful of adapting them to meet the individual children's needs and interests and your own setting environment and resources. So what to consider when observing? Well, not all observations are recorded on an observation form. Some are mentally recorded and used straight away to support teaching. Some are captured on photo or video, or perhaps samples of children's work or creations. Ensure that there are a range of contributors to observations. So the child's family, your colleagues, the wider team, for example, the cook, and external colleagues such as specialists. Observations from only one person is never going to provide you with the full picture of a child. Observing children in their own play is the only way to get the true picture of what a child knows and understands in a range of examples and situations. Approach observations with an open mind from a point of inquiry. Simply note down what you see and hear and don't make judgments. So, for example, you may see a child staring out of the window and note that they are not engaged, but if you look and listen carefully, you can see and hear that they are counting the clouds as they drift by. Or you might observe a child in the home corner preparing dinner, but when you look and listen closely, you see and hear that they are sorting the food into different groups. Observe the child's interactions with others, what they might be discovering, their interests, learning and development. Focus on how children learn, not just what they learn. So these are the characteristics of effective learning. It's really important to take account of children's interests and how they engage with learning, because without this, it'll be really difficult to plan effectively and provide appropriate teaching support. So, for instance, knowing that a child's particular interest is in sensory exploration or active movement, this will help you to plan activities to motivate them and engage them in learning. The characteristics of effective learning were all there in the original EYFS with detailed guidance on cards on what to look for, but they might have got lost. So now we're reminded again of how crucial they are to effective early learning. You may want to revisit these principles into practice cards as a reflective tool, and you can find them on the gov.uk archive website. So high quality observations often record more than the things you see every day. So before noting, consider, what will I do with this observation? Will I use it to plan or share it with parents? Observation should give you an improved knowledge of the child, such as a new skill or an emerging interest or fascination. So you certainly do not need to know absolutely everything. So moving on to the different types of assessment, we have some good practice and statutory assessments. So let's start with good practice. It's really useful to gain information on children's starting points, so their interests, their needs and stage of development when they join your setting. This will help you plan from the start. Starting point assessments don't need to be a formal assessment, but really just a gathering and sharing of information with parents to know how best to support the child. Knowing about a child's stage of development on entry helps you to recognise the progress that has been made over time from the start. We have ongoing assessment or formative assessment. This is what we do day to day when we observe, use the parents' observations and find out all about the children's achievements, interests, learning and development, and we use this information to plan and inform our teaching and interactions. Some of this might be recorded or noted down and some will not, as we're using it on the spot. We do this a lot in the early years, where we observe, make sense of what we see, and then action this, such as changing the environment or developing an activity or teaching strategy. It's called formative assessment because it informs planning and teaching. This should be shared with parents to support learning at home. Then we have summative assessment, which summarises the information we have on children at given points in time. So this might include current age stage of development, a child's particular strengths and interests, ways of learning, and next steps for development for both setting and home. And then we have two statutory summative assessments in the EYFS. They are the progress check at age 2 and the early years foundation stage profile. And beyond this, settings can just decide how often it would be useful to summarise learning and development, which is usually at set times during the year. We'll be providing lots more information and guidance on the progress check at age 2 as part of our observation, assessment and planning in the early years series. Of course, Parents should be kept up to date with their child's progress and development. This may be during daily feedback, meetings, home communication books, and more formalised summative assessment meetings. So, bringing it all together, the EYFS tells us that practitioners must consider the individual needs, interests and stage of development of each child in their care, and must use this information to plan a challenging and enjoyable experience for each child in all of the areas of learning and development. So, we use what we have found out from our observations and assessment to shape the learning experiences for children, and we use the children's interests and ways of learning as a way to motivate them and engage them. When we say learning experiences, this does not always mean an adult-led activity, but things like day-to-day interactions, the way we adapt the environment, make use of routine times, and what we add to or take away from the continuous provision. Continuous provision is what we have available in our environment for children to select from and explore. So an example might look like this. To support a next step or need to develop cooperative play with others and shared interactions, you might plan some activities to develop shared interactions. Thinking about the child's interest in musical instruments, you might imitate the child playing the xylophone and then develop this to taking turns to play the xylophone. You might think about your environment, such as developing cosy spaces where small groups can interact together. And you can think about your continuous provision and ensure there are enough matching items for children to imitate each other in play, therefore supporting shared interaction. Much of our assessment and planning will happen daily, on the spot. We apply next steps and move learning forward daily through our interactions and environment. So many settings find it helpful to record next steps for reference for all practitioners and for parents. So you might note down next steps for each child. But whether noted or not, once next steps have been identified, it's important that these are reflected in practice and teaching straight away. So, for example, a next step written for 3 weeks' time may actually mean the window of opportunity for learning is lost by the time you come to apply it. So this is why many settings are moving towards what is known as in-the-moment planning. So to summarise, observation, assessment and planning processes continually develop and evolve within settings. So further reading, research and training is always recommended. We will be developing further development and training resources focused on this. Hopefully this short webinar has provided some starting points for thinking and ideas. If you'd like any further support or guidance with observation, assessment and planning, please do get in touch at info@eyfsforme.com or visit the website www.eyfsforme.com to see how we can help. Thanks so much for listening.